Warning, there are spoilers ahead for this video. If you have not watched John Carpenter's The Thing, I highly recommend watching it before seeing this full review, though just make sure you're prepared for the thrill ride the movie will put you on. However, if you're not cool with animals, especially dogs, being killed in movies, well, sorry. Hope you enjoy the review. John Carpenter's The Thing is one of my favorite horror movies of all time. It's heavily influential with all the boundaries it pushed, and it remains a cult classic among several horror fans. Directed by John Carpenter and written by the late Bill Lancaster, The Thing was adapted from the 1938 novella Who Goes There by John W. Campbell Jr. The book centered around a group of scientific researchers in Antarctica who discover a UFO along with an alien life form frozen in a block of ice. They unthaw the alien, which then proceeds to terrorize the researchers for a period of time. Pretty much note for note what happens in John Carpenter's movie. This was actually the second time the story was adapted. The first film adaptation of Who Goes There was in 1951's The Thing from Another World, directed by Christian Nyby. A classic black and white horror flick that took elements from the original novella, but turned it more into a movie about some Frankenstein-type vegetable monster attacking a couple researchers. The film is pretty cheesy by today's standards, but it is still well regarded as a classic horror movie, and was even placed in the National Library of Congress back in 2001 for being culturally significant. A remake of sorts started forming around the mid-70s. However, the producers wanted to make a movie that was much closer to the original novella. After countless rewrites and concepts brought in by multiple filmmakers, which also included Tobe Hooper of Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Poltergeist fame, the film eventually landed on Bill Lancaster creating the screenplay for the movie that we pretty much all know today. John Carpenter had actually become part of the project back in 1976. But wasn't fully hired by Universal until after the smash hit success of the original Halloween in 1978, which essentially proved to the studio execs at the time that Carpenter was heavily capable of taking on their movie. Carpenter was actually a huge fan of the original Thing from Another World. He even briefly featured it playing on a TV in the original Halloween. But both Carpenter and writer Bill Lancaster wanted to make an adaptation that was much closer to the original book, and would also be virtually nothing like the original 1951 Thing. Released in June 1982, the same month that big movies like Poltergeist, Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan, E.T., and Blade Runner would be released. In fact, The Thing was released on the same day as Blade Runner, which was yet another sci-fi movie that would develop a cult following similar to The Thing. The film starts up with a Universal picture. What? Yeah, this movie doesn't start out with the usual Universal logo. Interesting. We see a UFO crashing onto Earth, which transitions straight into the amazing opening title sequence. A title sequence that John Carpenter purposely made look exactly like the 1951 Thing's title sequence, which is a pretty nice tribute to that film seeing how Carpenter was a huge fan. The movie begins with a Norwegian helicopter chasing after some dog. This leads them to our main location of the movie, a research station situated in Antarctica. Interestingly enough, while the movie is set in Antarctica, Carpenter and the crew actually shot most of the outdoor scenes in the British Columbia, mainly because the weather conditions were becoming the perfect fit for the movie's setting. The helicopter lands, but the Norwegian pilots accidentally blow it up after dropping a grenade, and still keep shooting at the dog, even hitting one of the American researchers. This ends with one of the researchers, Gary, shooting the remaining Norwegian in self-defense. This is quite a brilliant opening to the movie. Immediately it's filled with some mystery, and just leaves you with some questions like, why were they chasing this dog? What's wrong with it? Well, we'll find that out later. It's during this opening where we meet our main protagonist, R.G. McCready. McCready is portrayed by the legendary Kurt Russell with an even more legendary beard, which he said he spent nearly a year growing out just for this role. A beard that's so awesome it's only rivaled by the beard he grew out for Quentin Tarantino's The Hateful Eight. Apart from having awesome facial hair, McCready is an excellent character and the main driving force of the entire movie. Kurt Russell was actually one of the first actors to be cast for the movie, mainly since he had previously worked with Carpenter in the cult hit Escape from New York in 1981. Russell was also involved with the movie long before he was cast, helping Carpenter come up with ideas for the movie, which is pretty sweet. Rounding off the rest of the cast, there's Blair, the senior biologist, played by the great Wilford Brimley, who shaved off his iconic mustache for this movie, which just looks weird. There's Knowles the cook, played by T.K. Carter, Palmer, played by David Clennon, then one of the best characters, Childs, played by the amazing Keith David. In fact, this was Keith David's first ever major acting role, years before his famous voice acting credits in the future. That's pretty awesome. Moving on, there's Richard Dessart as Dr. Copper, Dennings, played by Peter Maloney, Clark, the guy who looks after the dogs, played by Richard Masur. Fun fact, Masur also read to play Gary, who's played by Donald Moffat, but chose to play Clark because, well, he loves dogs. Good for him. Or bad for him, considering what happens later. Wrapping up the cast is Moffat as Gary, Joe Polis as Fuchs, and Thomas Waits as Windows. If you didn't notice, this is an all-male cast. There's not a single female character in the movie. The only female character of sorts is a computer voice provided by Adrienne Barbeau, who was married to John Carpenter at the time of making this movie.
Checkmate. Checkmate.
Cheating bitch. And there goes the only actress to appear in this movie. Back to the story, the crew take the stray dog in as their own. Interestingly enough, the dog at the beginning was played by one of the random dogs they had for the movie, painted to look like the dog who plays the main wolf dog in later scenes. The part wolf dog was named Jed, and what's really cool is that he has some of the best acting I've ever seen portrayed by a dog. He did an excellent job making this dog come off as suspicious and creepy, acting almost nothing like the other dogs in the movie. He seriously did an amazing job. What a good boy. Back with the human characters, apparently they've been trying to reach people outside the station for quite a while, but they still haven't heard back from anyone. So the guys have just been passing time by playing ping pong and bickering with one another with some pretty snappy dialogue written by Bill Lancaster. All the actors do an amazing job portraying these characters. They all just have great chemistry with one another. Believe it or not, in the original book, there were a hefty 37 characters in the research station. And when Bill Lancaster was hired to adapt the book, he took one good look at it and went, "Nah, fuck that, I'm lowering the amount of characters." I think this was a brilliant decision since, well, 37 characters is way too much to focus on. Plus, Lancaster said he couldn't find any possible way to give each character the screen time and development they'd need. So good on him for taking liberties with the book. Back to the plot, MacReady and a few others head out in a helicopter to track down where the Norwegian pilots came from. They come across a burnt down base camp and go inside to investigate, where they find some pretty disturbing stuff. I love the way this scene is pulled off with the movie's excellent cinematography and great film score creating the perfect atmosphere for the whole scene. The movie's cinematographer was Dean Cundey, who previously worked with John Carpenter on the original Halloween, and would later go on to shoot Halloweens 2 and 3, the Back to the Future trilogy, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Jurassic Park, and Apollo 13. But let's not forget about Dean Cundey's other legendary credits, such as the live-action Casper movie, the Parent Trap remake with Lindsay Lohan, the live-action Garfield movie, and of course, his crowning achievement, Jack and Jill starring Adam Sandler. The musical score for The Thing is pretty interesting. While John Carpenter himself was a music composer, scoring his own movies like Halloween and Escape from New York, he could have easily just scored The Thing himself. However, he decided to hire one of the most legendary film composers of all time to help score The Thing, the amazing Ennio Morricone. That name may not seem familiar to you at first, but this is a man who has composed over 160 movies in his career, with some of these films being some of the greatest motion pictures ever made. Though, if you want me to keep things simple, he's the one who composed this famous movie theme. Yeah, he's that guy. Initially, Morricone was confused as to why Carpenter hired him, since he was well aware that Carpenter was capable of conducting his own music. But Carpenter explained that the reason he hired him was simply because he loved Morricone's music. This was the first major studio project John Carpenter was ever a part of, so he wanted to take advantage of that as much as he could. The film score by Ennio Morricone is excellent, and it's easily one of his best soundtracks ever. Believe it or not, despite receiving an honorary award in 2007 and previously receiving 5 nominations by the Academy, Morricone never won an actual Oscar until he composed Quentin Tarantino's The Hateful Eight, a movie that, interestingly enough, used some unused orchestral music that Morricone initially made for The Thing way back in 1982. So in a way, John Carpenter's The Thing is partially responsible for helping this legendary composer finally receive his long-awaited award. Good job, man. One last thing I want to point out is that whenever Morricone won his Oscar, the first thing he did was hug John Williams, who he was sitting right next to. Aw, how sweet. I like to think they're huge besties in the music industry. Back to The Thing. While investigating the burnt down base, Mac and the others come across a weird burnt up humanoid looking corpse, which they end up taking back to their base so Blair could perform an autopsy. This is one of the first of many alien props we'll see throughout the movie. To make the alien effects look as unique and unearthly as possible, Carpenter hired Rob Bottin and his team of nearly 40 crew members to work on the special effects. Bottin, who had previously worked with Carpenter on 1980's The Fog, was just 22 years old when he started working on The Thing. It is amazing what he and his team accomplished, even though it may have worked out a little too well. A lot of the actors claim that while filming the autopsy scene, the charred remains of the alien corpse disturbed and grossed out everyone. Wilford Brimley, who was the one dissecting the corpse, would go on to say that he disagreed with the level of gore in the movie and felt that it would affect the audience in a negative way. And he technically wasn't wrong, though I'll discuss that near the end. I actually think this is a huge compliment to Rob Bottin's amazing prosthetic work, and just goes to show how much effort he really put into making sure these type of alien effects really disturbed the audience. Bottin overworked himself so much that he spent over a year living in the Universal lot just to work on the effects, claiming he did not take a single day off during that time, and chose to sleep in locker rooms or even on the film set, though at one point he needed to be checked into the hospital after suffering from severe exhaustion, a double pneumonia, and even a bleeding ulcer. Jesus Christ. The fact that Bottin put himself under so much stress just to make sure these special effects worked is seriously incredible. And it really worked out for the better. At least I feel it did. Also, if you thought the scene with the alien autopsy was bad enough, you seriously have not seen anything yet. Later on, Clark, the dog guy, takes the stray dog to be with their other fellow canines. This leads to one of the most infamously brutal, yet impressively awesome sequences in the movie. We finally see the Thing in action as the wolf dog splits its head open and starts mutating into this horrible looking creature. It starts spraying the dogs with some suspicious looking liquid, and begins sucking up the dogs to absorb them. Oh god. This scene is horrifying and sad for the dogs, but I still think it's an awesome display of Rob Bottin's practical effects work. Remember, this was 1982. Apart from Disney's Tron, CGI was not a thing yet in movies. Everything you're seeing on camera here is really there. That's bonkers. God, just seeing the head split open with the dog skull just plop down like that, ugh. It still gets to me. Oh man, this is so damn disgusting. I love this shit. For this scene in particular, Rob Bottin wanted to be almost nothing part of it. Not because he found the subject matter too disturbing or anything like that. Actually, he honestly supported all of it. But he said he was just sick of designing and working on dog prosthetics after previously working on the 1981 horror flick, The Howling, directed by Joe Dante. So he decided to ask for the help of the great Stan Winston to create the dog things sequence. Stan Winston would later go on to create the iconic Terminator effects and the still amazing looking dinosaurs for Jurassic Park. The dog thing was one of the biggest contributions Stan Winston helped out with this movie, and he did an amazing job here. Then again, it's Stan Winston, of course it looks good. Winston would also help with making a few of the other alien scenes, mainly to help take some stress off Bottin and his team of, again, nearly 40 people. What a trooper. So yeah, after that huge mess is over, Mac and Childs burn the remains of the alien, while Clark attends to the surviving dogs. Everyone's clearly wondering just what the hell was that, so Blair dissects the creature's burnt corpse in another disgusting scene. Oh man. He discovers that the group stopped the creature from fully copying the dogs, which was why it was trying to be a dog to blend in with the others. Mac and another group then decide to go back to the Norwegian camp to find more answers. They come across an evacuation site where they discover something kind of crazy. A massive UFO that was frozen under a block of ice, which an old VHS recording shows that the Norwegians blew it up to get the UFO out the ice. So this pretty much means the creature is an extraterrestrial capable of imitating other life forms. So the group eventually realized that if the creature could imitate the dogs, then what's stopping it from imitating humans? This leads to one of the major parts of the film's plot, and one of the biggest reasons that I keep going back to this movie. With an alien that can easily hide as another character, what's to say that not one of them is already the Thing? This results in several scenes of the characters going back and forth with one another, accusing each other of being a thing, as they keep calling it. This is where Lancaster's writing and the actors' performances really shine. I always get a kick out of seeing these guys trying to figure out who's a thing and who's still human. It helps keep the viewer invested, and really builds up a great sense of paranoia as even you start to wonder who could be a thing and who's not. One thing that especially doesn't help is that the corpse of the alien comes back to life and ends up assimilating with Bennings. Thankfully, the group notices this beforehand and torches the fucker before he can finish mutating into Bennings. This creates even more tension between the characters, fueled even more by an angry Blair who sabotages all the vehicles so the others can't escape, and destroys the radio to prevent them from contacting anyone outside the area. Oh yeah, he also killed the remaining dogs, which is super sad. Everyone teams up to stop a panicking Blair, and they eventually hold him up in a tool shed a little bit away from their location. The reasoning why Blair suddenly freaked out is up for debate whether or not the thing got to him at this point in the movie, but I like to think he wasn't a thing here yet, but he was just mainly panicking over the idea of the thing being able to make it outside the area to infect other people. And the fact that he's stuck in the place where the alien is still around probably terrified him. I think his mindset is summed up really well when he tells this to MacReady.
I don't know who to trust.
Really makes you think, huh? Fun fact, by the way, according to John Carpenter in an audio commentary, he claimed to have gotten way more complaints towards this movie about the close-up shots of needles being inserted into someone's arm, way more than the overly graphic alien effects, which I just find hilarious. Though to be honest, the needle close-up shots in the movie do get me to wince way more than the alien effects. So I'm honestly not surprised Carpenter got these complaints. Later on, it's decided that they should do a blood test amongst everyone to see if that will help them figure out who's still human. However, someone got to the blood they kept in storage and sabotaged it. This leads to another great scene of the group arguing and pulling guns out on each other. Again, the actors do an amazing job in these scenes, and it helps build up more suspense on who in the group could possibly be a thing. Carpenter's directing here is so good. Once things settle down for a bit, they torch the rest of the alien corpses to try and submerge the thing from infecting anyone else. Later on, the group tries maintaining the base. However, while Fuse is alone doing research on the thing, he ends up bumping into a very effective jump scare accompanied by a synthesized sound effect courtesy of John Carpenter.
Who's that?
After that, a few of the guys go check on Blair to ask him if he knows where Fuchs is, which leads to a really dark, yet kind of funny visual.
Blair, have you seen Fuchs?
I don't want to stay out here anymore. I want to come back inside.
Yeah, Blair apparently tried making a noose and is acting a little suspicious. This is where most people agree that Blair has completely become the thing at this point of the movie, and yeah, I agree with that. I like to speculate that the noose was made by Blair when he realized he was turning into the thing, and tried to kill himself before he was fully taken over, but it clearly was too late. The group come across the burnt remains of Fuse, who MacReady thinks must have purposely burned himself when he was about to become the thing. I always wondered, would killing yourself really stop the thing from taking over your body? This is a concept that's always interested me ever since I first watched this movie. Sometime later, Knowles heads back to the camp and tells the others that he thinks Mac is one of the things because he came across the ripped remains of one of his jackets. This assumption is actually further backed up by a previous scene where MacReady is recording himself on a tape recorder, and he makes a guess that when people turn into the thing, their clothes might get ripped up, which is another interesting idea. Shortly after realizing MacReady might be one of the things, Mac starts banging on the doors to be let in, but the others lock him out because they all assume it's way too late for him. However, Mac breaks in and threatens to blow everyone up with sticks of dynamite if any of them try to burn him. This leads to Norris suffering a random heart attack, which ends up causing him to stop breathing. So Copper brings him to the infirmary to defibrillate him, and yep, Norris was a thing. Excellent jump scare, holy shit, and an amazing turn of events for the characters. Which gives us another special effects show as the corpse of Norris starts mutating into some of the most disgusting sequences ever put into this movie. This scene alone contains some of the most iconic imagery from this film, and it's well earned thanks to Rob Bottin's amazing practical effects. Not to mention, the sound design here is so good. The alien sound effects heard during these sequences just sound so horrific and memorable. They sound like something not of this earth, which is great. Oh my god, I love this scene. It also leads to one of my favorite lines of dialogue said when Norris's head forms spider legs and tries crawling away.
You gotta be fucking kidding.
Honestly, I'd probably say the exact same thing if I was in this type of situation. Well, after all that shit gets taken care of, MacReady decides to do his own test on everyone, which ends up leading to more arguing. and results in Mac shooting Quark out of self-defense. Afterwards, Mac forces Palmer to tie everyone down, including the corpses of Quark and Copper, which sounds really pointless to do, but it leads to another favorite line delivery from Palmer that's honestly one of my favorites.
This is bullshit, Mac.
Finish it, Palmer.
They're dead, Mac.
We are then presented to one of the best scenes in the movie. Actually, it's probably the best scene in the movie, and it's also the main one that made John Carpenter want to make this movie in the first place. MacReady takes samples of everyone's blood and decides to test out if any of them are a thing. To do that, he heats up a metal wire and dips it into the blood samples. How exactly is this going to determine who's the thing? You'll see. The overall tension presented in this scene is so perfectly executed. This is probably the main scene in the movie I've rewatched the most because it's so fascinating to see. Even though I already know what happens in it, it's just so entertainingly nerve-wracking to see over and over again. It's easily one of John Carpenter's best directed scenes he's ever done. I adore this scene. Also, Carpenter said he received even more complaints about the close-up shots of the characters cutting their thumbs open. Just like the needle close-ups, I always winced at these shots. They're probably completely unnecessary, but I feel they help add to the uneasiness feeling the movie is trying to give off. I really like the detail where Mac checks if Quark was a thing, but when he dips into his blood, nothing happens. Then Childs accuses Mac of being a murderer since Quark probably wasn't a thing. This always made me question whether or not Quark was a thing or not. Like, how far does this really go? Like, was Quark a thing all along? Or did the thing leave his body once Mac killed him? Also, Childs, in Mac's defense, he did shoot Quark out of self-defense. The motherfucker was about to stab him with a scalpel. Could you really blame him for shooting him? Anyways, eventually Mac gets to Palmer's blood, but ends up briefly bickering with Gary, who doesn't believe the test is even working.
I thought you'd feel that way, Gary. You were the only one that could have got to that blood. We'll do you last.
Okay, amazingly earned jump scare. One detail I especially love about that scare is that you get a close-up shot of Mac dipping his wire into the character's blood. The hand holding the cup is actually a fake hand. This explains how they were able to rig the animatronic jump scare to operate. It would make sense that they would use the fake hand for the shot of the alien jumping up, but John Carpenter went as far to shoot a previous close-up of Mac with the fake hand to let the audience get used to the shot. So that way, when the jump scare finally happens, it almost completely catches you off guard. That's so fucking brilliant, I can't believe it. God, I love this movie. What's also brilliant is getting yet another special effects display as Palmer completely turns into a thing. Thanks again to Rob Bottin's amazing effects. I mean, the bit where the thing eats up windows and his body turns into a dummy kinda looks a bit goofy, but still good effects nonetheless. We even get to see some impressive fire stunts as the thing bashes through an incredibly thin wall, to which MacReady blows him up with a stick of dynamite. Fun fact, by the way, Kurt Russell said when he threw the dynamite to explode, the aftermath threw him completely off guard and he almost fell off his feet. He was not expecting the coming explosion to be as big as it was. It's pretty funny, but I'm glad he didn't get hurt. Well, Palmer's out, but so is Windows since he's pretty much contaminated with the thing. So Mac burns him up too. Then the rest of the blood test scene plays out pretty humorously. Once Knowles is proved to be human, then it directly cuts to a shot of Knowles standing next to Mac as they're testing the blood. I think that was a pretty humorous jump cut. And it gets even better when Childs turns out to be human as well, and demands to be cut loose.
Come on, get me out of here! Cut me loose, damn it!
Brilliant. Then the blood test and the best scene in the movie comes to an end as Gary turns out to be human too. He proceeds to give the group his response.
I'd rather not spend the rest of this winter tied to this fucking couch!
There was literally no other way they could have ended this perfect scene. Brilliant. Just brilliant. After all that's over, Mac, Quark, and Knowles head back to the tool shed to test Blair, but they pretty much get their answer once they go inside. They discover that Blair had an underground cave where he was constructing a flying saucer, basically confirming that Blair has fully become the Thing. Eventually, MacReady realizes with the weather getting colder and colder, the Thing is probably thinking about hibernating until a rescue team comes along, and they'll presumably be killed and taken over too. So Mac, Quark, and Knowles come up with a plan to basically blow up the entire base using dynamite. Also, you may have noticed this, but Childs mysteriously vanishes from the group. Anyways, while setting up and detonating the dynamite in pretty much what's become a suicide mission by this point, Blair appears and assimilates with Gary, making him a goner. Ugh, look at the way his hand just digs into his face. Ugh, it's so gross. Knowles doesn't make it too far along either, as he vanishes in the dark while he was helping MacReady set up the dynamite.
How's it coming in there? I said, how's it?
I love Kurt Russell's reaction here. That's some great acting. This leads to the grand finale of the movie where the Thing finally reveals itself in one last special effects display. Fun fact, by the way, while the practical effects look amazing here, we even get a brief glimpse of stop motion done by Randy Cook, who would later go on to do the special effects for the Lord of the Rings trilogy. There were actually a few more shots of the Thing portrayed in stop motion that was made, which looked incredible too. However, John Carpenter decided to cut the extra footage out of the final film. Kind of a shame, but I would argue that the brief stop motion we do see in the movie is probably the only visual effect that I think has aged the worst in my opinion. So maybe cutting the extra shots was for the better. Don't get me wrong, I still love the way it looks, but I think the stop motion animation in comparison to the other practical effects looks the worst for today's standards. Anyways, the Thing roars at MacReady, who then responds with probably the best and most badass reply I've ever heard said to a giant alien monster.
Yeah, fuck you too!
Excellent. The scene ends with some glorious and very real explosions. Again, this isn't CG. These are legitimate dynamite explosions, which is fucking crazy. They basically blew up the entire set just for the movie. This had to have cost them a fortune to pull off. The film finally ends with one of the greatest closures to any movie ever. Mac managed to survive the explosions and sat down for a drink, only to be interrupted by Childs, who appears out of nowhere. The two bicker and eventually come to the conclusion that none of them really trust each other, though it doesn't seem like they're in the best of shape to do anything about it, especially after all the shit they went through tonight. The two eventually decide they'll just wait out the night and see what happens, with this scene containing the best piece of dialogue that perfectly describes how this ending is gonna play out.
How will we make it? Maybe we should.
That is so eerie, but fucking brilliant. And with the nightmare seemingly over, Childs and MacReady sit back, share a bottle of scotch, and wait out the rest of the night to truly see if the Thing will pop up once more. This is where the film ends. I adore this ending to death. And it's probably because we just don't get a clear answer on who's a Thing or not. Carpenter and Lancaster purposely left it up to the audience's interpretation, which helps further add to the movie's sense of paranoia. Honestly, it's just a brilliant ending that's left a lasting impression on me ever since I first watched this movie years ago. Just a great ending to a great movie. I love it. Well, The Thing was released on June 25th, 1982, and it didn't pan out too well. The film was a critical and commercial failure, grossing just a little over $19 million at the box office. It managed to make back its $15 million budget, but it was nowhere near the success that Carpenter and Universal were hoping for. To make matters worse, the film was absolutely savaged by critics. The story, characters, tone, and especially the practical effects were heavily panned. The plot was called boring, the characters were lacking, and the special effects, while they were receiving praise, were also the main source of the movie's complaints. A lot of the critics felt the effects distracted from the story, and that they were way too graphic and disturbing. The film's reception was so negative and poor that the magazine, Cinefantastique, proposed that it was the most hated film of all time. Roger Ebert called it nothing but a geek show and gave it 2.5 stars out of 4. The movie was called Instant Junk and the quintessential moron movie of the 80s. Starlog magazine's Alan Spencer called the movie cold and sterile. Most critics were just not letting up on this movie. The film did manage to receive 2 Saturn nominations for Best Horror Film and Best Special Effects, but ended up losing both to Poltergeist and E.T. respectively. Meanwhile, the Razzies would go on to nominate Ennio Morricone's soundtrack for Worst Musical Score. Great. I'm sure they didn't long regret doing that. Honestly, yeah, I heavily disagree with a lot of the critics back then who shat on this film. I feel like the general shock factor of seeing these graphic special effects must have been overwhelming for these critics to handle, and their long-lasting effects on their viewing experience might have distracted them from focusing on the great character moments and terrific tension-built scenes. Though one other reviewer back then that I'll single out is Gene Sisco, who some of you may know had a TV series with Roger Ebert called Sneak Previews, where Gene and Roger looked at upcoming movies and had in-depth discussions on each flick. While Gene was well known for disliking a lot of cult hit movies, shockingly enough, he was actually quite favorable to The Thing. While he did comment that the special effects made the movie ugly, I'd probably go as far to say he was most likely one of the only critics at the time that really appreciated the strong filmmaking in The Thing. This was really interesting to look up, and I recommend going watch the Siskel and Ebert review on The Thing. It's insanely fascinating.
Yeah, I think that the movie for me, though, isn't about those characters as individual people. I think that's why they can be interchangeable. I think that it's about how a society, this little group here, wants to poison, they think something's going wrong, you're not in the group, you're out, move, just that line, move away to one side. It's a very chilling thing. And I think if you read the movie in that way, then the implausibilities at your level mean very little. And so you sit there wishing, and I do wish, that it were a lot cleaner.
The terrible reception of The Thing really left a lasting effect on John Carpenter. Carpenter says he takes every failure hard, and the failure of The Thing was the hardest bit that really hit him. My career would have been different if that had been a big hit. The movie was hated, even by science fiction fans. They thought I had betrayed some kind of trust, and the piling on was insane. Even the director of the original 1951 Thing, a movie that Carpenter was a huge fan of, denounced Carpenter's film. Christian Neebe went as far to say, "If you want blood, go to the slaughterhouse." All in all, it's a terrific commercial for J&B Scotch. Yikes. The impact of the movie's reception was massive for Carpenter, who later became depressed for a short while because of it. He didn't openly talk about the movie's failure until a 1985 interview with Starlog magazine, where he mentioned, "I was called a pornographer of violence. I had no idea it would be received that way. The Thing was just too strong for that time. I knew it was going to be strong, but I didn't think it would be too strong. I didn't take the public's taste into consideration." It also didn't help that Carpenter was due to direct another movie by Universal, Firestarter, a film in which Carpenter recruited Bill Lancaster to write a draft for the movie. However, after the poor reception of The Thing, Carpenter and Lancaster were both let go and replaced. Carpenter's career ended up getting affected by the movie for a while. It wasn't until some years later when The Thing seemed to have gained quite a following thanks to TV broadcasts and home media, and the film ended up receiving somewhat of a re-evaluation. Rob Bottin's effects, Bill Lancaster's smart script, and John Carpenter's sharp directing were finally getting the recognition they deserved. Filmmakers like Guillermo del Toro, J.J. Abrams, Edgar Wright, and even Quentin Tarantino would cite The Thing as a major influence on their work. By 1998, The Thing had gained quite a cult following, which ended up leading to the movie to be worked into modern-day pop culture. Hell, by 1991, Dark Horse Comics would start a comic book series called The Thing from Another World, which had stories that took place after the events of the 1982 movie. There was also a 2002 video game that also took place after John Carpenter's movie, with Carpenter even approving the story for the game, along with voicing a character. Then, of course, there was the 2011 prequel, released by Universal under the same title, The Thing, which ended up getting negative reviews and a disappointing box office, but I'll cover both that movie and the 2002 game later. John Carpenter, who was disappointed by the movie's initial reception, would later go on to be more favorable towards The Thing. He would even go as far to say it's probably his favorite movie he's ever made. He remains proud of his and his crew's work on The Thing, thinking they've made the best possible movie they could have for its time. Rob Bottin would continue working in Hollywood, providing some memorable special effects in movies like the Twilight Zone movie, the RoboCop trilogy, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and even Fight Club. However, it was the 1990s sci-fi action movie starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, Total Recall, that would lead to Bottin receiving a Special Achievement Oscar for his work on the movie. Bravo! Bottin has seemingly retired from the movie industry since 2014, and honestly, he deserves his retirement after the decades of work he put out. Well earned. On a bit of a sadder note, Bill Lancaster would never write another movie ever again. The Thing ended up becoming his last film since his first draft for Firestarter was never used. He would end up dying from a heart attack in 1997 at the age of 49, which is sad, but I'm at least happy he got to see his work on The Thing get the recognition it seriously deserved before he was gone. Rest in peace, man. John Carpenter's The Thing is an excellent movie. It's practically the crowning achievement of 80s sci-fi horror. It's a movie I'll keep going back to watch again and again, and I'll never get sick of it. It's one of my favorite movies of all time, and quite possibly my favorite movie from John Carpenter. The DVD and Blu-ray for the movie go for pretty cheap these days, about $10 on Amazon for each. Though if you're a huge fan of the movie, I would highly recommend getting Shout Factory's excellent Collector's Edition Blu-ray, which contains a ton of special features and other things. Plus, the packaging on their shit is always good, so you're really getting your money's worth. So yeah, go check out John Carpenter's The Thing if you have not. Unless you didn't care about spoilers and decided to watch my entire review anyways. But still, go watch the movie. It remains a phenomenal piece of filmmaking and one of John Carpenter's best. Great movie.